The rain lashed against the windshield as Isabel turned onto the gravel road, her headlights barely piercing the darkness that seemed to close in around the car. Beside her, Clara, her eldest daughter, sat silently, clutching the map they'd printed days before. In the back seat, little Rose slept, her head tilted against the window, her soft breaths misting the glass. Isabel envied her daughter's calm, for her own chest was tight with a strange, unshakable unease. The farmhouse loomed ahead, barely visible through the sheets of rain. Its silhouette was jagged and uneven, the peaked roof stabbing at the night sky. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing, and the porch sagged under the weight of years. Isabel swallowed hard. She had convinced herself this move was necessary, a chance to start over after her husband's passing, to give her daughters a semblance of normalcy. The farmhouse, inherited from a distant relative she'd barely known, had seemed a gift. Now, it felt like a trap. As they stepped out of the car, the air was heavy, thick with the earthy scent of wet soil. Isabel tugged her coat tight against the wind, her boots crunching on the gravel as she ushered Clara and Rose toward the front door. The key, old and tarnished, turned with a reluctant click, and the door groaned as it swung open. Inside, the house was colder than the storm outside. Isabel fumbled for the light switch, but the bulbs buzzed faintly before flickering into dim life, casting long shadows across the walls. Dust coated every surface, and the air carried a faint, metallic tang. The house seemed to breathe, the wind outside finding cracks and seams in the old wood, whistling softly through the halls. "I don't like it," Clara murmured, her voice almost swallowed by the gloom. "It's just old," Isabel replied, though she felt the same unease. "We'll fix it up. It'll feel like home in no time." They moved quickly, setting down boxes and unpacking essentials. But as the hours passed, the house seemed to resist their presence. Doors refused to stay closed, creaking open as if nudged by invisible hands. The floorboards groaned underfoot, the sound echoing unnaturally. Later that night, as Isabel tucked Rose into bed, the little girl clutched her stuffed bear tightly and whispered, "There's someone here, Mama." Isabel's stomach twisted. "It's just the wind, sweetheart," she said, smoothing Rose's hair. But as she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In the hallway, a faint scratching sound caught her ear. She froze, her breath hitching as she turned toward the source. The sound seemed to come from the far end of the house, where a narrow staircase led to the attic. Isabel shook her head, chastising herself for letting the old house get to her. It was probably just a loose branch scraping against the roof. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the storm having left behind a damp chill that seeped into the farmhouse. Isabel brewed coffee in the tiny kitchen, while Clara sat at the table, her gaze fixed on the far wall. "Did you hear it last night?" Clara asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "Hear what?" Isabel replied, though she already knew the answer. "Footsteps, in the attic." Isabel's grip on her mug tightened. "It's an old house, Clara. Wood creaks, that's all." But Clara wasn't convinced. It didn't sound like creaking. It sounded like... She hesitated, her voice dropping. Like someone walking back and forth. Isabel forced a smile. "There's no one here but us." That afternoon, she decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, she ascended the narrow staircase to the attic. The air grew colder with each step, and the wooden stairs groaned under her weight. The door at the top was heavy, its surface scarred with scratches that ran deep into the wood. Isabel paused, her pulse quickening. Why would anyone scratch at a door from the inside? She pushed the thought aside and turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing the attic, a cramped, shadowy space filled with old trunks, dusty furniture, and cobwebbed corners. Isabel shone the flashlight across the room, half expecting to see... what? A figure, a pair of eyes staring back at her. Nothing moved. The only sound was her own breathing, harsh and uneven in the still air. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye, a faint trail of footprints in the dust, leading toward a boarded-up window. Isabel's mouth went dry. The prints were too small to belong to her, and Rose hadn't been up here. She knelt to examine them, her fingers brushing the cold wood. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from behind her. She whirled around, her flashlight beam darting across the room. The sound had come from one of the trunks, its lid now slightly ajar. Heart pounding, Isabel approached the trunk. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside was an assortment of faded photographs, their edges yellowed with age. The faces in the photos stared back at her, expressionless and unnervingly familiar. At the bottom of the trunk lay a journal, its leather cover cracked and brittle. Isabel hesitated before picking it up. As she opened it, a faint whisper seemed to ripple through the attic, so soft she almost thought she'd imagined it. She turned the first page. "Beware the harvest moon," it read in spidery handwriting. Isabel felt the air grow heavier around her, the attic pressing in like a living thing. This house had secrets, secrets that didn't want to stay hidden. The journal sat on Isabel's nightstand like a black hole, drawing her attention no matter where she stood in the room. The words she'd read haunted her, whispering at the edges of her thoughts. Beware the harvest moon. She hadn't told Clara or Rose about the journal, unsure of what to make of its cryptic warnings. Instead, she spent the next few days delving into its brittle pages whenever she found a quiet moment. The entries, written in hurried, uneven script, told the story of the farmhouse's former occupants, the Harrow family. The Harrows had lived here decades ago, a quiet family who had kept to themselves. But as Isabel read further, the tone of the entries shifted. The writer, presumably one of the Harrows, spoke of strange occurrences, whispers in the walls, shadows that didn't belong, and dreams of a glowing harvest moon that loomed unnaturally close to the earth. The final entry chilled her to the core. The moon is calling. I hear it in my sleep. If we stay, it will take us all. I must go. That night, as Isabel sat in the living room, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, she tried to make sense of what she'd read. The harvest moon was just a name, a phase of the moon, wasn't it? But as she looked out the window at the sky, she couldn't shake the sense that the moonlight spilling over the fields was different, sharper, almost alive. A faint thud upstairs broke her concentration. Isabel froze, her breath catching in her throat. The noise came again, softer this time, like the patter of footsteps. "Clara!" she called, rising from her chair. There was no answer. She climbed the stairs cautiously, the old wood creaking beneath her feet. Clara's door was ajar, the room dimly lit by a sliver of moonlight. Isabel peeked inside, finding her eldest daughter fast asleep, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. She checked Rose's room next, and it was the same. The girls were undisturbed, their dreams unbroken. As Isabel turned to leave, she heard the sound again, faint but distinct. It was coming from above her, the attic. The memory of the footprints in the dust sent a shiver down her spine. Isabel hesitated, her hand on the banister, but a deep instinct urged her not to go back up there. Whatever was in the attic could wait. She hurried back to her room, shutting the door firmly behind her. The next few days passed in a haze of rising tension. Clara and Rose seemed increasingly uneasy, though neither of them said much. Clara spent her time drawing, creating page after page of strange angular shapes that made Isabel's skin crawl when she caught sight of them. Rose, usually talkative and bubbly, had grown quieter, her eyes darting toward the windows whenever she passed them. "What's wrong, sweetie?" Isabel asked one afternoon as Rose stared out at the field beyond the house. "The moon is staring at us," Rose whispered without looking away. A chill settled over Isabel. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she wrapped an arm around Rose's shoulders and guided her back inside. On the night of the harvest moon, the air felt different, thicker, charged, as though the farmhouse itself was holding its breath. The moon hung low in the sky, impossibly large and glowing with an eerie orange hue. Its light spilled across the fields, making the shadows stretch long and distorted. Clara and Rose stayed close to Isabel, their unease palpable. Even the comforting crackle of the fireplace couldn't dispel the creeping dread that filled the room. "Let's all sleep in here tonight," Isabel suggested, pulling blankets onto the couch. The girls nodded, too frightened to protest. The hours dragged on, each minute heavy with tension. Isabel lay awake, her ears straining against the silence. It felt like the house was listening. Then it came. The sound was faint at first, like a soft hum reverberating through the walls. It grew louder, resolving into a low, mournful tone that made Isabel's chest tighten. She sat up, her heart pounding. Clara clutched her arm. "Mom, what is that?" Before Isabel could answer, the room grew colder. The fire flickered and dimmed, the shadows on the walls stretching and twisting unnaturally. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, a whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. "Beware!" Isabel jumped to her feet, pulling Clara and Rose with her. "We're leaving, now." But as they reached the front door, it refused to budge. Isabel pulled harder, panic rising in her chest, but it was as though the door had fused with the frame. Behind her, the hum grew louder, almost deafening. The walls trembled, the shadows dancing like living things. Isabel turned toward the sound, her breath catching as she saw the faint outline of a figure, standing in the hallway. It was featureless, a silhouette of swirling darkness that seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the harvest moon. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, pressing down on the room like a weight. Isabel pushed the girls behind her, her voice trembling. "Stay back." The figure tilted its head, as if studying her. And then, with a sound like rustling leaves, it dissolved into the shadows, leaving the room deathly silent. For a moment, Isabel stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Then the whisper came again, soft but insistent. "Beware the harvest moon." The hours after the figure's appearance blurred together in a haze of fear and confusion. Isabel and the girls stayed huddled in the living room, too terrified to move. The shadows on the walls no longer seemed like tricks of the light. They felt alive, shifting and swirling with a malevolent intent. As dawn approached, Isabel's determination hardened. She needed to understand what was happening, to find a way to break whatever force had taken hold of the farmhouse. The journal held the answer. Flipping through its pages, Isabel found a passage she hadn't noticed before, scrawled in hurried, uneven script. "The moon binds the house to its will. Only the light of dawn can break its hold. But beware the cost. Once the moon sets, it always returns." Isabel's stomach clenched. The cryptic warning didn't make sense, but one thing was clear. They needed to last until sunrise. The house, however, seemed intent on breaking them. The shadows grew bolder, creeping closer with each passing hour. The air felt thick, oppressive, and the strange hum reverberated through the walls, rising and falling like the breath of some unseen entity. "It's watching us," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Isabel placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, trying to steady her own nerves. "We'll get through this. Just stay close." As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the oppressive atmosphere in the house intensified. The hum grew into a low roar, the shadows swirling wildly as though in protest. Isabel clutched the girls tightly, willing herself to stay calm. And then, just as the first rays of sunlight pierced the windows, the house fell silent. The shadows receded, the air lightened, and the oppressive hum vanished. For a moment, it was as if nothing had ever happened. But as Isabel looked out at the fields, she knew the peace wouldn't last. The harvest moon would rise again. The following day was eerily quiet. The farmhouse bathed in a pale, washed-out light that seemed to sap the color from everything it touched. Isabel moved through the house in a daze, her body heavy with exhaustion. Clara and Rose stuck close to her side, their fear manifesting in whispered questions and clinging hands. The weight of the previous night still lingered, an invisible presence that pressed against their chests with every breath. By afternoon, the journal had become Isabel's lifeline. She pored over its pages again, desperate to find something she might have missed. There had to be a way to sever the house's connection to the harvest moon, something the Harrows hadn't tried, or hadn't survived long enough to attempt. Toward the back of the journal, scrawled in handwriting so jagged it looked almost carved into the paper, she found it. The veil is thin on the night of the harvest moon. What is taken may be returned, but the price is steep. Beware the light that promises freedom. It blinds as much as it reveals. The words offered no clarity, only more questions. Isabel shut the journal with a frustrated snap, its brittle pages crackling like dry leaves. That evening, as the sky darkened and the sun sank below the horizon, the tension in the house became unbearable. The wind had picked up, howling around the farmhouse like a pack of unseen predators. Isabel lit every candle she could find, the flames casting faint, flickering light that did little to dispel the deepening shadows. "Mom," Clara whispered, breaking the uneasy silence. "The moon, it's rising again." Isabel turned toward the window. There it was, the harvest moon, swelling like a blister on the horizon, its amber glow drenching the fields in unnatural light. The sight sent a chill down her spine. "Stay here," she said, her voice steady despite the fear roiling inside her. "What are you going to do?" Clara asked, her wide eyes shining with tears. "Find a way to stop this." Isabel grabbed the journal and a lantern, then headed to the attic. The air grew colder as she climbed the stairs, each step creaking like a whispered warning. At the top, the heavy attic door resisted her push, as though the house itself were trying to keep her out. She leaned into it with all her weight, and it finally groaned open. The attic was darker than before, the faint glow of the moon barely illuminating the cluttered space. Isabel's lantern cast a feeble light, revealing the boarded-up window and the trunk where she'd found the journal. She approached it cautiously, the shadows shifting like restless watchers at the edges of her vision. The journal's cryptic warnings echoed in her mind as she knelt by the window. She pried at the boards, her fingers numb with cold, until one came loose with a splintering snap. The amber glow of the harvest moon flooded the attic, revealing strange, swirling patterns etched into the wood beneath her feet. They pulsed faintly, as though alive. Isabel's breath hitched. This was it, the house's connection to the moon. She opened the journal to the page she'd found earlier, the words blurring in the flickering light. The instructions were vague, but she understood enough. The moon's light was both a gateway and a trap. To break the bond, she had to let it flood the house completely, but only until the first rays of dawn pierced the sky. The thought terrified her. She'd seen what the moonlight could do, but there was no other choice. Returning to the main room, she pulled Clara and Rose close, explaining as calmly as she could. "We have to let the light in. It's the only way to stop this." Clara nodded, though her hands trembled. Rose clung to Isabel, her small voice wavering. "Will it hurt us?" "No," Isabel said firmly, stroking her daughter's hair. "I won't let it." Together, they unshuttered the windows, allowing the moonlight to pour in. It spilled across the walls and floor, illuminating every corner of the farmhouse. The shadows writhed and twisted, as if recoiling from the light, but they couldn't escape its reach. The house groaned, the sound deep and resonant, like a living thing in pain. Isabel clutched her daughters tightly as the floor beneath them seemed to tremble. The air grew thick, humming with energy, and the patterns on the walls began to shimmer, glowing faintly in the amber light. And then, just as it seemed the house might collapse under the weight of the moon's presence, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The moon's light faded, retreating like a tide, and the house fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt sacred. Isabel exhaled shakily, her grip on her daughters loosening. "It's over," she whispered. But as they looked around the farmhouse, Isabel noticed something subtle but unsettling. The shadows had returned to their natural forms, but they seemed deeper now, darker, as though the moonlight had left something behind. She glanced at the journal, now lying forgotten on the floor. Its final words echoed in her mind. "What is taken may be returned, but the price is steep." Though the harvest moon had set, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching, still waiting. The price had been paid, but she wasn't sure who or what had collected